Prontinho, pessoal, vocês estão vendo?
Sim, o
Nós
vídeo
vemos
tá...
aqui, mas na plataforma nada acontece.
Ok, atualiza a página para mim, por favor. 3, 2, 1 e atualiza. Foi?
Sim.
Perfeito.
We, them, us, them, stop killing us. What if we, instead of walls, we built us, 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 stop killing us. Brazilian Forum for Public Security. 14th meeting. Good afternoon to all. Yes, good afternoon to all. It is a pleasure to be in this once more in this edition, and its 14th edition of the Forum for Public Security. It's been 14 years of activities in the field of public security in Brazil, with a high-level debate with the participation of professionals for public security and criminal justice, criminal law, managers, researchers, with the goal of diminishing the distances, the breaches, and build bridges. On this board, particularly, we'll deal with innovation in the field of violence that develops in the state of Pernambuco, which is classic for its engagement in public security and citizenship. It is an opportunity, a pleasure, and an honor for all of us. My name is Eduardo Pazinato, and I'm talking for the on behalf of the UNODC, and we're here in the National Day for Human Rights to debate this theme that is so fundamental, which is prevention of violence and conduction of new policies on drugs and the improvement of public policies in this field based on evidence. In the approach that we will be doing in this board, we will treat innovations of integrated governance in the public policies for prevention of violences, the Pernambuco case. And we will count on the presence of Cloves Benevides, Secretary of State of Pernambuco for Prevention of Violence and Drugs. Very much welcome, Secretary Cloves. We will count on the participation of the coordinator of the Unit for Governance Justice of the program of the UNDC for Brazil, DOC for Brazil. Welcome, Moema. We'll count on the presence of Daphne, Besen, analyst in the programs for ONU-Habitat, and we will have also the participation of Melina, Director of Programs of the Igarapé Institute, and also a partner organization of this joint participative participation with the United Nations through PNUD, UNODC, ONU-Habitat, with the participation of civil society with Instituto Igarapé, also in the state of Pernambuco, with the leadership of Secretary Cloves Benevides, around this institutional innovation on the policy of violence and drugs in the state of Pernambuco, improving even more the known Pact for Life, whose the characteristics have been emphasized in these forums for security. We have simultaneous translation for English, and we will have the participation of the audience sending its questions, which will address to the speakers. These doubts and questions will be handed over to the colleagues who are with us debating here, this important debate. We will have the presentation of this new policy for the state of Pernambuco through Secretary Cloves, and then the participation for 10 minutes, the first block of Moema, Melina, Daphne, and then the final block with 5 more minutes for each one of us. Secretary Cloves will have 5 minutes to present the scope of this important public policy so that we can join the sharing of perspectives, views of each one of the organizations that are here represented and what they have developed in a partnership with the state of Pernambuco. So I'll hand over the floor to Secretary Cloves, please. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Secretary. I am yet to see you. The video, oh, there it is, yes. Good afternoon. I would like to thank very much the organization of the Brazilian Forum of Public Security in its 14th meeting, this opportunity of exchange and learning. And I would equally like to thank our coordinator, Eduardo Pazinato, who represents UNODC in this board, in this interaction. And I would equally like to thank FBSP from ONU-Habitat, Melina Rizzo, our program director of Instituto Igarapé, and Moema Freire, coordinator of the Unit of Governance and Justice for PNUD for Brazil. This is a very important opportunity for the government of Pernambuco. Pernambuco has a dedication to integrated policies for governance. He has a good history in the construction of the Pact for Life, and it doesn't close an eye to the challenges we have. And we have the fortune of work with hand in hand with 3 units, with PNUD and also Instituto Igarapé, in the building of this new scenario for policies for the prevention to the violences in a more ample way, in the context of the program Pacto pela Vida, Pact for Life. I will just make a small we can identify your presentation. It's right here. Okay. We are the Secretary for Prevention, our policies for prevention to violence and drugs. It's an initiative from the government from the year 2019 that has separated some structures that were due for social development and human rights, and creating an environment that would focus exactly that, to identify practices, projects, and programs that could induce to strategies and behaviors that would go beyond the prevention, embracement, sheltering of people who were engaged in the practice of drugs and other crimes, and using, among other programs, Pacto pela Vida. Besides everything, Pacto pela Vida is at the birth of this policy in Pernambuco. In the year 2000, Pernambuco had a more serious rates of violent and lethal crimes, CVLI, among all of Brazilian states. And at the time, the governor, Eduardo Campos, integrated the several actions of the state in a centralized logics of governance that integrated police practices, and having in view goals that could be that would be feasible. And this all came in a general scope for public security called the Pacto pela Vida, Pact for Life. It determined the governance of this program, centered in a management committee, and at that time, several technical chambers. In the present day design, we have a chamber for social prevention with the role of discussing related themes regarding violence, and a second chamber talking about policies on drugs, when there was a struggle against the fight with a program called Crack is Possible to be Won Over. Now is the Chamber of Policies for Drugs. And at the same time that police action, judiciary powers, the government, the socio-educational, prisonal, penitentiary systems, integrated in together with the policies for women, dialogues with the internal actors, stakeholders of the government, and with the chambers on a weekly basis. Until these days, we have preparatory chambers every day with reunions that are organized and directed by the coordinating secretaries. In the case of social prevention and policy on drugs, the Secretary of Prevention to Violence is coordinated by this secretary, Prevention to Violence Secretary. There is a management committee coming from the Secretary of State of the state that is given the numbers and data of the transversality of the construction of the narrative of integration of Pact for Life, and the Secretary for the Social Defense. So weekly, every Thursday, all the regional structures come to a board, present their data, their goals, and they have pacts for their goals and organize their systems of coordination. And once a month, the governor of the state presides the management committee and makes a reading of all the process in that month, pointing out to needs of improvement and pointing to situations that deserve emphasis given the practices that were generated. All this process has a system that is produced from CEPAG, which has the data from all areas and permits us a capacity to make decisions with agility and certainty. There is a dynamic of actuations for amplification and improvement of the policies as to resources, financial resources to be discussed in the same environment. So the strength that defines the process for public security given by Pact of Life is this governance that is kept from this methodology and this structure. Pact for Life has had, like all policies for security, it has had certainties and mistakes given the complexities and phenomena that happen. The best numbers of the Pacto were gotten in the year of 2013, and in 2017 we have had a new situation of growth as well as the country, and with reductions that were significant in the years of 2018 and 19 until 2012, where once more other challenges were put forth, like the pandemics. This is a picture of the panels that we use, where you can see the CLVIs that were present, and the tendencies and variations, and the comparison as to what was made and what was new challenges and strategies that were put forth, with the variations that are perceptible and the challenges that were identified. Here, one more drawing of the prevention chamber. In 2015, we were able to insert, in the context of the pact, the first initiative for evaluation of numbers for prevention, for the policies for prevention. Obviously, it is a process that is still superficial, given the difficulties to organize these numbers at that time, and the absence also of basis that could, foundations that would permit measurements that would be more adequate, and the evaluation of some situations that are much more processual, such as home visits for convicted people who went out of jail, participation of the penitentiary system, and the participation of individuals that live in vulnerable areas for conflicts against among gangs, and the absence of CLVI rates, evaluation rates, and processes in 2005. And also the numbers of assistance in the two central programs, which are the program Attitude in the field of drugs policies, and the program Government is Present, which are the strategic programs nowadays in the conduction of these policies. These are the central programs, the ones that are in the scope of our policies, and which orient and shelter the users. A program that is destined to users of alcohol and drugs in a situation of threatening, and this according to the policy for public security, focused in areas of which the indicators point out to the needs of more intense action, more organized action, and more planned, less universalized and more singularized in the follow-up of the cases, and therefore it makes available for each one of these regions a group of initiatives: an attitude on streets, active search, social interviews, social service for psychology, and a mobilizing agent whom driving the vehicle makes an approach personally to the people and makes a mapping, a reference with services around this scene of use, and the follow-up of these people, whether they are the ones that are interested in the service, or someone who needs some strategy, some possibility of low demand to keep the link of protection for the cases related to violence, given the disputes in the commercialization of drugs. Also, a center for sheltering and support, a logic for day shelter for food, with food, and a number of features that train and strengthen the abilities of the users impacted by the program, and those also, for those who are under violence threats, presenting risks that are more serious, the possibility of staying the night in a strategy for protection. Also, an intensive sheltering is the third level of assistance in attitude for those whose social links are crossed with social threats, and that are more intense and more perceived as serious. And also the impossibility of being able to get, other types of approach, and psychosocial approach with more intensive action for up to 6 months, renewable as to the demand of the user, and the technical team evaluation so that this scenario of protection constitutes itself, and also a strategy for social leasing, which talks about this, deals with the different types of approach of each one of the phases of users as a program of reference in which we act in the state. This is organized in 4 nuclei in Recife, Jaboatão dos Guararapes, in the city of Caruaru, and in the city of Cabo de Santo Agostinho. All of these are areas in which the indicators, especially CLVI, related to criminal activity linked to drug trafficking, presented a challenge, and that's why we chose these bases, because of the intensity of crime there. For you to have an idea, from 2011 to 2020, there were 27,000 people. These are the identities, 27,700 identities that were dislodged for assistance. And in 2014 to 2020, 953,000 that were put in shelter systems and professional support and others like workshops, integrative workshops, and skill formation, etc., etc. Equally, we have another program, which is the program of the present government that welcomes the various practices that we consider to be necessary for territorial action. The government decided then, or defined the territory as a unit for response, and from 4 indicators: CLVI, CVP, robbery to passers-by, attempt to attack, CLVI, and one more, sorry, it's 3 only, sorry. CLVI, and the 2 others. 59 territories were defined, and there we offer different services for the prevention policies. Territorial plans are then a first strategy with the mobilization of the local community. Follow-up for priority universes, which are the ones that are coming out of the user scenario, and plans for other linked follow-up strategies, control teams, and actions for citizenship that are really great combined work groups, whether it's for the acquisition of documents, birth certificates, health services, access to social benefits. In each weekend, a group of activities is offered in one of these territories. And lastly, just to talk about the programs, a new action was organized, which we called Youth Present, Juventude Presente. It mirrors strategies of programs that were very well evaluated, such as Ficar Vivo, Stay Alive. It mirrors the strategy for action in territories. It focuses on youngsters between 12 and 19 years of age, and it is an objective strategy to reach potential or eventual adolescents who are in the range of possibility of becoming authors or victims of crime, with 3 strategies. 1, fostering of cultural, social education, a great response in the professional qualification, whether in measures that are presential or from remote education platforms, with more than 15,000 vacancies offered every 6 months. And lastly, social cultural connections, which are a group of more than 500 workshops with people selected in those territories and those who know the dynamics of that territories, which are supervised by technical teams and that act with adolescents in several modalities chosen by the territories themselves or by the adolescents themselves from these connections in time and space, in reflection, dialogue, exchange, especially for social protection for the adolescents as a strategy for prevention, and with the possibility of having 18,000 vacancies offered in the several territories. And lastly, and which is the object of our commemoration, in the context of this arrangement that Pernambuco did, there was the opportunity of the cooperation with the agencies that you represent here, ladies and gentlemen, and also with the Igarapés Institute, so that we can now, in a sincere, honest, and transparent way, to improve the practices of this joint group of measures that are put forth, and to develop measuring strategy and better directing of our policies, orientation of our policies, from the look that we might have in the evidence of hypotheses that have been structured from several practices in Brazil, the best practices of other countries, but also from what had been sold in the field of innovation. So it is a perspective that is very strong. And I would like to, you will be debating this, of course. It's a very important moment of exchange, yes, but this technical assistance from this cooperation will represent for Pernambuco the consolidation of the cycle in three different areas. The intersectorial areas, which from the products offered in this cooperation permits us to integrate, in fact, really in a very objective and resolutionally situations, the areas of the government which from these instances of integration will be able to amplify themselves, become capitalized and qualify the practices, avoid reworking and simplify the work for the people in these territories. The development of urban space of good quality as a strategy and the integration of the most vulnerable population into these spaces as three great areas for convergence for what we call policies for prevention to violence in Pernambuco. But showing our initiative, we have figures such as the evaluation of the policies for drugs and the establishment of parameters for its improvement, and the analysis of best criteria to analyze the services are initiatives that please us a lot. Also, an observatory for prevention, calling for good practices for this debate, permitting self-criticism, rereading, redirecting, reorientation, but also having goals to be established from these orientations and these new ways to observe the data and the possibilities of intervention. And lastly, the several methodologies for intervention in urban spaces, which added to strategies, such as our compise in the city of Recife, a very modern program with a social practice that is totally honorable, can gain proximity with the population and the strengthening of the sensation of security in our policy as public security. There are 4 areas in this project, in this cooperation, and 17 products linked to the modern phase, as our governor says, the more qualified phase of prevention of violence from the cooperation with you, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank you, asking to be excused because I went over my time. Pernambuco. And the program Attitude is now prepared to bring the strategy, the policy for prevention to the same space of quality, the same space for articulation, the same space for responsabilization and definition of best practices and goals in which the program already managed in the context of the Pact exists. So this new maturity phase is to assist the Pernambucan citizen to avoid violence, especially for groups that are more vulnerable, with a focus on adolescents and youngsters, and with a very serious articulation between secretaries and also civil society. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm available here for you. With our title in our thematic board, this innovation has been very clear. When you point out the importance of public policies being traced and based on evidence, so that the decision making by the public managers, and when you talk about the technical scientific diagnosis, the emphasis on the risk factors and the social segments that are more vulnerable, when you talk about the importance of the monitoring and evaluation, including from a historical perspective to improve this policy, more than a security policy that is from the citizens or to the citizens, an integrated one. I believe that Pernambuco is an important beacon where we see coming down of human rights all over the world. It is very, very stimulating that we can share with you this experience in Pernambuco, which, besides being innovative, it is a life-saving one, a governance that goes to meet the necessity of saving lives. Thank you very much for your intervention. And before handing over the floor to Moema Freire, my colleague, I greet colleagues Taini Ferretti Moraes, who sends us messages. Raini is our partner since always for ONU-Habitat, our leadership in themes related to urban policies. She has a very interesting job. And Daphne will share a little bit with you about the participation of ONU-Habitat in this work that has been with several hands in it. I also thank the work of Gabriela Leonardo, who congratulates us for the mechanisms pointed out that make sure there is a respect of sectors and integration on the part of the public organs. I also want to greet colleague Livio Nascimento. I would like to thank him for being with us in the assistance, and hand over the floor to Moema Freire, who represents, as I said, the United Nations Program for Development. She is a coordinator for Unit of Governance and Justice in PNUD in Brazil. The PNUD, which is the agency of the United Nations that has this innovative action with the participation of UNODC and Instituto Igarapé. Please, Moema, your initial participation, please, of 10 minutes. Based on this very dense and deep presentation of the work developed by the state of Pernambuco in this field. Please, thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start thanking Cloves Benevides for this important partnership. I'd like to say that it's an honor to collaborate with the state in such an innovative policy that has brought so many results for the lives of many people, especially those who are more vulnerable. I want to thank my colleagues who are joining us in the discussion, Daphne, Melina, who are also essential in the implementation of this initiative. I'd like to start by remembering the importance of the landmark that we have today. Today is the International Day of Human Rights. It has been more than 70 years since the Declaration of Human Rights, and This is something that has stated that any person is entitled to have its rights preserved regardless of his conditions, beliefs, ethnicity, and so on. So these are aspects that guide us, as pointed by Secretary Cloves. I'd like to remember that this year, the International Day points to the importance of actions of response at the beginning of the pandemic should be guided by human resources, and we should use this opportunity in which we are being forced to readequate a series of policies to strengthen the inspection of human rights in all our actions. So I believe that this landmark is very convenient for us to celebrate the practice of the state of Pernambuco and share the experiences that have been developed with the help of the United Nations. As my colleague Pazinato mentioned, the United Nations Development Program works for the development, as it is said by its name. And for us, the development is not only seen as in the increase of GDP, but it also privileges this view towards people. So we should enable possibilities and opportunities so that people can fulfill their trajectories in life. We had an important landmark in 2015. Member states of the United Nations, Brazil included, signed an international document, the Agenda 2030, and they were a very important landmark for security policies because for the first time, countries could, at an international level, agree that security and justice policies are an objective and an essential condition for the fair development of all countries. Why is that important? Because to member states and countries, so that they can plan their development actions, public security and justice actions are fundamental aspects to be strengthened so that the right conditions for accelerating development can be achieved. I'd like to highlight that when we look at development under this view, with this view centered on people, an essential point is this intersectorality, this interchange between different aspects. An important aspect for all public policies areas is strengthening the practice of this interconnection so that we can have integrated results and effective results for the end beneficiaries who are, after all, the most vulnerable people. Talking about experience from Pernambuco, I'd like to emphasize this characteristic as pointed by Cloves. I believe that the experience highlights this aspect. How can we do things in practice? How can we have a good intersectorial governance for violence prevention? This is an innovative aspect and quite interesting for us to keep our eyes on because it sheds some light on how to give the operation to a more effective public security policy. So I'd like to emphasize this point from the presentation by Secretary Cloves. How in practice, in practical ways, the state can strengthen this articulation between the different sectors of public policies with this focus on violence prevention. The second aspect I'd like to highlight is the territorial scope. The concept of development gives importance to this idea that all actions should go from top to bottom and be adapted to the existing capacities in the territory and to the necessities of the people who live in these territories. That's why this territorial focus aspect is important, while it reaches effective results because this view is present. These are not generic policies, but policies that are made to match the essence of each of the territories. The aspect of the policies based on evidence In the Agenda 2030, a series of indicators are proposed so that this progress can be measured, and they are very much related sometimes to public security issues. And it's important that the policies follow the same trend, both for their formulation and for their monitoring as well. And here we have the perspective by the observatory that's going to be implemented in the state with the support from Igarapé Institute that is going to strengthen the generation of data and base of evidences that will enable us to monitor the evolution of public policies. And finally, I'd like to go back to what motivated the start of my speech, this day on which we celebrate the International Day of Human Rights. We need to focus on the most vulnerable populations, especially during the pandemic, in which we know that these populations are largely affected by crisis contexts. We need to be concerned with these population who is further away from policies. It is essential that no one is left behind in this journey for the development in fairer, more peaceful and more inclusive societies. So again, congratulations to the state of Pernambuco, and keep on counting with us to keep on strengthening this journey towards the prevention against violence. Thank you very much. Excellent, Moema. Thank you very much for your initial observations. So now we are going to move on, but I'd like to point the importance of what Moema said. I read it as this: there is no right to security without the security of human rights. This is something that the United Nations Development Program has championed, and many other agencies and the organized civil society, and most likely the experience of Instituto Igarapé will contribute in this field. Now I'd like to give the floor for the initial considerations by Melina. She works at the Igarapé Institute. It's a pleasure being here with you. Please.
Thank you, Secretary Cloves, my colleagues at the board in here. It's a pleasure to be here. And I would like to tell the same way that Moema talks about the importance today of security in this moment. We have to celebrate the human rights, a fundamental term for the whole of humanity, where we understand justice, liberty, rights as fundamental elements when we treat in this board, where we think of innovation from the prevention of violence. Reminding us that the prevention of violence here is what we've been working, studying with this theme for a long time. How do we deal with people without focusing in inequalities, to think of development, to think of skills, and the equality of opportunities for all? We have a problem there, of course, and it is very important that we talk about this theme, especially at this time. And we'd like to celebrate and speak of my joy to be part of the project. Back then, when we talked with the Secretary of the State of Pernambuco, it's a state that has innovated for Brazil and has shown different ways to make policies for public security. And once more innovates when they put prevention of violence at the center of its agenda. We've been following policies in the whole of Brazil and several parts of the world. We always see the preponderance of the part of application of law and repression, but fewer times in prevention. So from a first moment, when the government decides to create a secretary dedicated to prevention of violence and the reduction and thinking of drugs policy in another way, it's an absolutely essential thing to bring a new parameter to Brazil, where we can have solutions that are very concrete. After all, it is only investing in prevention and closing the flow. Otherwise, more and more people are coming into violence. If we do not interrupt the entry of new people in this system, this machine that is so difficult to avoid, to continue producing more violence. We've seen many people, many children dying as a result of violence. It is important to see at what moment we are in Brazil with a reversion in the rate of homicides. To put prevention at the center of the agenda is the only way to think of sustainability of the policy for public security and to sustain numbers that would be lower and lower and attain logics and results that are satisfying. Secretary Cloves has defended that and have been making efforts so that this policy be implemented. So what is the next step? Pernambuco advanced, learned several things, showed to Brazil and to the world how you can follow up in a very serious way homicide reduction and follow up the territory, the goals, follow up what's happening really, and to come into this innovation. And I'm thinking on how we transformed the policy for prevention of violence. I'm very glad to be part of this. And our idea is how do we add up efforts from the possibilities that exist nowadays to transform and use our intelligence in repression. So we always talk about having hotspots, use of intelligence and the centers in the hot areas to make this repression. How do we bring the same mentality in the actions for prevention? And here there is a dilemma for everybody who works for a long time in this, have worked for a long time in this. How do we localize these individuals? One element about the territory is very important. We see this from criminal indicators. A territory gives us the map as where this is the concentration of homicides. We know the causalities. There are several elements of the territory itself on the situation of that environment that favors, for example, the crimes. And there's a whole technique to look at this. And there is an element in social prevention that is very little developed still in Brazil, which is how do we localize these individuals who have risk factors that are associated, whether it be behavior, whether it is age, or whether it is different kinds of public, because in the same territory, we have differences between the people who are there. There are risk factors associated, risk factors, and we have to make public policy get to these people. I have followed these policies since a long time ago, and there's always the challenge as to how do we connect. We think of public equipment that we have to format within public policy. And when we format public policy, we always think about the school equipment because it is in the territory, but we forget, or maybe we know, but it's very difficult to come out of this logic that when individuals are in school, they already have a protection factor that is put there. The thing is to find those who went out of the school, dropped out. How do we invert the logics of, instead of acting into those who are already connected to the school services, how do we change and make an active search for those who are not inserted in schools? So the idea, and nowadays, at a time when technology permits us to make the survey on data and think of this intersectorial structure that we so much talked about here, brings not only actions, but also makes us think in this logics from the diagnosis. So the idea that we have helped in our participation is how do we help the state government to format these information in a way that there is the establishment of a level that is not only knowing the territory where there is more crime, but to understand who that individual is. If we know who the individual is, we have to understand, did he leave school? When? Does he have an aggression problem that is being assisted by the health system? Does he have any problem regarding mental health, which increases violence risk of violence? Where do we get this volume of information to permit public policies to be done in a proactive way? So we don't wait We don't expect anything, waiting for people to get to our system, because after they get there, they get to us, they are very seriously affected by the situation already. How do we anticipate ourselves to these problematics? From the crossing of information from different sources, which we already do, yes, but we continue to have a challenge there. Everybody who works with data knows what the challenge is to be able to cross the information. And more than that, how can we cross them at the level of the individual, at the level of the family, and to think of the information that can be making it more easier for implementing the policy. From the observatory and discussing with the team of Secretary Cloves, how can we get enough information so that it makes it possible for us to design a policy almost as an individualized plan for each one of these people. ECA vows for that, and thinking of the individual in their units, in their different dimensions. We know that the problem of violence is very complex, and crossing this volume of information, understanding the different dimensions, sometimes facilitates intersectorality too, because many times the information comes from one sector, but action should be from another sector. I'll give you a concrete example. Many times we identify a person that came in as a victim for a homicide attempt in a hospital, and he's being treated for his health. But the adequate treatment when he comes out of the hospital is still health. But when he comes out, it's no longer health, it's social assistance, to see whether the risk that he had at that place in the hospital was reduced. And if it wasn't, I have to have a policy for sheltering of this individual. So the crossing of the information with technology can make us understand the individual in all his or her dimensions. This is essential for us to be able to change the logics and change the views on how this has to be done, the crossing of information. That's the idea that Igarapé is taking over in this project, to help the Secretary to understand the dimension of the individual, to think on a policy of protection and prevention that might act in the necessities of these individuals. It's an enormous challenge, and we are adding up efforts to build this innovation in Pernambuco here. Pernambuco is always available to innovate and implementing actions of that nature. Thank you, Melina. My friends, we have more than 200 people who are inserted into our panel here. It's a theme that raises attention, showing that more than criticism, it's possible to build public policies, especially in this area, with action in prevention. The importance of prevention in this policy for public security in the scope of governance, but it's not new at all in its purposes. They were contained in the Pacto pela Vida, the Pact for Life, and especially about having care and resilience and empathy for these social segments. As presented by Moema, these sectors are much more affected in these times of pandemic, vulnerable for the inequalities that they go through in their existence, and build up factors for risk, and which we have, as was said, to advance in the elements of protection with, and the observatory doubtlessly will help in this process. I'm very glad to see that we are connected to Instituto Igarapé for the elaboration of metrics for indicators for juvenile vulnerability and compliance with police activity, especially for youngsters, and that the prisonal institutions where we have to have care for the gangs formed in penitentiaries. It is important to point out to these aspects and find that that was the choice of Governor Paulo Câmara for the policy as a whole, prevention, to revisit the basis of Pacto pela Vida, Pact for Life, and to make reduction of CLVI become again lower. I hand over the floor to Daphne, our competent and talented representative of UN-Habitat, who has a living presence in Alagoas and Pernambuco. I hand over the floor to Daphne, and after that we come to the final round for comments for each colleague, and then I'll formulate or share some questions that have already been formulated. But don't go out, please. We have news for the celebration of this day. And we have colleague Alessandra. I won't say anything more now, but at the end, you will see this homage, not only for the presentation of the policy for Pernambuco in this field, but also this homage, a visual homage that will come on the screens now. Change.
Thank you very much, Pazinato. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to greet Secretary Cloves, my colleagues at this panel, Moema Freire, Melina. It's a great pleasure to be here at this meeting, especially on today's date, a date on which we celebrate the International Day of the Human Rights, and talking about this project for the violence prevention in Pernambuco. They're having many months and conversations so that we could prepare and finally implement this project with our partners at the United Nations agencies and Igarapé Institute. It is important that we have the beginning date of our projects, the day of November 20, which is the day of Black awareness. I'd like to talk about the project, but before, some international global development goals should be mentioned. They should serve as guidelines for governments, institutions, and agencies. We still have 10 more years for the year of 2020 for the fulfillment of Sustainable Development Goals. And with that, we may have an opportunity for the recovery of cities and states. The Sustainable Development Goal 11 has as its purpose making cities more resilient, safe, and sustainable. And there is also the SDG 17 and number 30 that defends that we should provide safe spaces, in particular to women, elderly, children, and people with special disabilities. This is an urban agenda that guides how we plan, build, and manage urban spaces. The urbanization has the chance to promote the sustainable development. With that, cities can contribute for a more inclusive, safe, and sustainable future. And I would like to read a paragraph of this SDG that synthesizes what I'm about to say. We commit ourselves to promote safe, inclusive, green, and sustainable urban spaces, including many different places in urban areas for the integration and social inclusion, and also health, human well-being, cultural exchanges, and the expression of a wide variety of cultures, so that we can build pacific, inclusive, and participative societies, promoting connectiveness and social inclusion. The actuation of the United Nations Habitat had as its main goal contributing to the development of knowledge and methodologies that can induce prevention of violence and promotion of social cohesion in the entire state. The main goal of the United Nations Habitat was producing qualified information, what was commented by other agencies, and that they may also subsidize in the formulation of public policies by the state, acting in the area of social prevention based on evidences. This is our motto. And with these studies and methodologies that were developed, we give special attention to the public spaces, women and young people, as well as the development and strengthening of strategies that appreciate the intersectorial work for the prevention of violence. With that, the United Nations Habitat uses methodologies and tools created by the agency. And the first one to be developed at the first stage of the project that has already started is the Safer Cities project. This project has a holistic and participative focus for the reduction of violent crime and the adoption of plans and strategies for urban security with participative and inclusive approaches that can contribute to a safer and fairer city for everyone. This Safer City program has a preventive approach to urban crime with three main pillars: promotion of the role of subnational government and the proposal of alternative forms of policing and bringing justice close to population, protection to vulnerable groups, and importance of the physical space, the design, the planning, and urban management. Besides the preventive approach, the program also works with this multidimensional approach for the construction of a sustainable urban security plan. This is a continuous and complex process. And with the implementation of the Safer Cities program, we need qualified data and information, a decision-making process based on evidences, and a multidimensional approach that can also be integral. Talking about methodologies of the Safer Cities program, one of the main methodologies that we will use are the audits for women's safety. The focus is on watching the needs and personal experiences of women, and also having the perception that different groups perceive and experiment the violence and its effects differently. And here we must listen, give voice and protagonism to these groups. No one knows better than themselves how it feels to experience urban violence. And here we want to identify insecurity factors, trying to encourage women to engage for changes of these conditions. And we also want to turn this diagnosis into tools for the demand of specific public policies. This methodology includes workshops. These workshops are organized in a form of a conversation and also with a social cartography of violence, in which women can point to places where they feel safe or less safe. And we also have a mobilization with these groups and rapprochement with these groups and local players in these territories, which is something we believe is quite important for this mobilization. And the results of these workshops can then finally remain in the territories where they were started. And this methodology also enables a critical assessment of the urban environment, increasing the awareness of violence against vulnerable groups, and pointing how women and men live and experience urban spaces differently. And here we don't analyze just gender security only, but also racial security aspects as well. Another methodology that was used at this first stage is also included in the global program of public spaces. And in this program, we have the promotion to the right to the city, indicators of environmental and public health indicators, prevention to crime and violence, and the importance of social inclusion and spaces as tools for the generation of opportunities, social participation, and citizenship movement, especially from women, children, elderly. There's a research that points that the cities that work best are the ones that have 50% of their surface area dedicated to public spaces. And unfortunately, very few cities can reach such a large percentage. Most of them suffers from the lack of space, then resulting in the decrease of quality of life, traffic jams, and urban violence. So public spaces can serve as a leverage, contributing to more cohesive and safe communities, and also for the reduction of social inequality. In this program, we conduct workshops for the design of urban spaces that can be made by young people, teenagers, adults, and elderly. These workshops can happen several different ways, and they can be adapted to the territories and the local context where they are conducted. And we really hope that when we are to perform them, we can finally perform them in person and not online, because we would have a great loss of interaction if we were to do these workshops online. Finally, we have two methodologies of United Nations Habitat that are part of the project, but not at the first stage. And their main objectives are the data, the index of city prosperity, a multidimensional approach to urban prosperity comprised of 6 indicators. This methodology has been implemented in more than 500 cities in the world, making an analysis that can connect the SDGs to the location and the public spaces. The socioeconomic profile has as its purpose understanding the characteristics of the populations of these selected areas, raising socioeconomic indicators through house research, and assisting in the formulation of public policies for the improvement of the quality of life of the population, pointing to demographic characteristics, income, leisure, sports, access to social equipment, and territories. And here, the territory, we also receive a focus on the fight against drugs. With this data, we can make a comparison of Pernambuco and the rest of the region, the country. We are then able to see the data in charts and make decisions based on evidence. I believe that I have reached my time limit. I thank you again for the invitation, and I hope that everything is clear. And the participation of United Nations Habitat has all the purposes that I mentioned, and we are really proud to take part in this meeting, and I hope to see you in person soon. Thank you. Wonderful, Daphne. You brought the importance of these indicators and the participation of young people, women, and the ethnic racial dimension, the role of the cities, the role of urban planning in this context of how these transformations can contribute to a more inclusive society and public policies that can effectively reach the goals that you want. Since we are at the final minutes of our panel, I'd like to ask 2 questions that have come to me through Gleidson Alves. One of them is a question, is how the organizations, how we see the importance of the diagnosis for the construction of public policies at municipal level. And in this aspect, and how the micro-political dimension can interfere in the relation of inhabitants with the public government, with the public agencies, considering our tradition that constitutes the historical dynamic here in Brazil. I'd like to give the word to Moema, then next to Melina and Daphne, in 5 minutes to each one of you. And at the end, I give the floor to Secretary Cloves so that he can give the closing message, and then we will have a surprise, a
Thank you,
tribute
Pazinato.
to
I'll be very brief here. The issue on diagnosis as a basis for prevention policies. It is very important. PNUD works on UN with this first phase, local diagnosis for acting. And in this diagnosis, it is important to consider not only the elements and data related to the indicators that are affected by this data in that locality, but already what exists in that territory that can be used with the new policies for implementation, so that we don't have to make a new diagnosis, so that there isn't no overlapping of actions already existing, so that we can optimize this local network and legitimize it and strengthen it. The other point is the local micro policy with the citizenship methodology also for public policies for prevention of violence. We have the aspect of social participation. So we have to work on this aspect. How can we integrate society to work in this relationship between society and the institutions to strengthen pillars of confidence, trust of the institutions, and make a transparent dialogue among all parts? And that reinforces this aspect, which is a characteristic that we observe in the methodology presented by Pernambuco. The last little point I would like to point out to the international application of this practice. All the agencies of the United Nations that are participating here and other partners have this international capillarity, and we hope that the project may make other people lean onto this project, so that it is brought internationally as a reference for best practices in the policies for prevention of violence. Thank you. Melina, please. I think the local dimension and the diagnosis, especially when we talk about prevention, is essential. This composition, what we've been talking about, these challenges, how do you collect that information to have a systemic, integrated view for that family, for that person in a risk situation? Thinking of the Federative Pact of Brazil, there is a need for coordination of all the entities, because it is the division of the public institutions is also segmented, separated. There is a separation in local coordination with the municipalities, because part of the actions that have been gotten is also localized, such as busca ativa, active search. There is a fundamental relationship between municipality and state. I'm sure the Secretary will make some comments about this dimension of unification between state and municipalities. And to revert this scenario, public security, especially prevention, puts to us the challenge of integrating these two. And it's so difficult because we don't integrate only different sectors among, for example, police, health, education, social assistance. I also make an integration, and I point out to the necessity of vertical integration, how policies of the federal government are established, and how they have an inductive capacity also, an inducing capacity among the other entities, and looking at the state, and also the relationship with the municipalities, who in general do the primary attention, the primary system. And when we look at inequality, there is an absence of primary assistance. And that's what takes to situations of violence in a strong way when we see that the data. This is an absolutely important dimension. And what we have been bringing to the program, which is our discussion of all the agencies of state government, is how to think about the evidences and how to make the investment coming from what the evidence tells us. So how do we overcome sometimes clientelist logics that are there in Brazil, and do according to the data or to what the data show us. It is very important to bring evidence up, to bring information up, to make decisions, and to make decisions where investment is most needed. This is the logics of the project. And I would like to point out the last innovation that we talked so much about, innovation of the policies, yes, but the contour of having different agencies of the United Nations working in a joint effort in a certain territory in a coordinated way. I would like to point out to that dimension of innovation, which many times when you look to the whole federation, you forget about that dimension. But for the ambit, the scenario of the United Nations, this coordination of three agencies thinking of a certain territory, working together, and we've had these meetings for governance on how these actions might be or not be aligned so that one thing favors another thing and so that we have a joint action. This is an innovation element that is very important to be pointed out to in this session in which Pernambuco is launching innovation to the whole. So, certainly, Melina, thank you for your observation. The institutional design of this partnership is an innovation in itself, in assistance. Thank you, Daphne, please. Daphne, please. Well, to complement and pulling up what she said about innovation, nowadays we talk about innovation as it was technology, new apps, Zoom, and everything online, etc. But the innovation here today is the dialogue innovation, the conversation, the conversion. This is the result of several efforts, and we have a single objective. Each one has their own expertise, different areas, but the final goal is the same, which is to prevent violence in the state of Pernambuco, working with the data, considering these data, so that we can strengthen public policies that already exist in Pernambuco. I think it's important to mention also that Pernambuco already has many of these data, and it is work which somehow becomes simpler to get to a territory where you have such data and a lot of research also, and also the implementation of success policies that are known internationally. So it makes it easier for the habitats work with participative initiatives. So answering to the question about territory diagnosis, it becomes much easier to work when we have an asset of data that have been gotten in these territories. So our work, we can see like a photograph of these data, and we can understand the necessities and the demands, the suggestions, and the stories of each vulnerabilized group, and coming to collaborate with the secretaries of the state of Pernambuco. Also, we have to invest in the evidence, yes, as Melina said, to be able to deliver to the state these reports and products that can represent the reading of this data. So hearing the territory and bringing it to the correct space. ONU-Habitat has been making the organization of what already is there. We have the local stakeholders, we have collaboration in place. So it's to join all this together, organize it, and take advantage of what already exists, adding up to technologies with better policy and political will on this. I'll hand over the floor to Secretary Cloves to make the closure of our meeting. And saying that the UNODC, besides being an observatory, we are organizing indicators and will replicate a methodology for research in the area of drugs for the first time in Latin America. We'll make an evaluation of the services that are available for the population, the public policies that are available for the population in the area of drugs, including the surprised at a program which is called Attitude, but also focusing on prevention care, people who make use of drugs, alcohol and other drugs. It is a pleasure to be here as brothers in this initiative, and I hand over the floor to Secretary Cloves so that with his habitual power of synthesis can make the closure of our meeting. And the surprise, remember, we have like, what, 2,000, minimum 2,000 people who are coming to celebrate also the Day of Human Rights. Well, with my power of synthesis, that is not that good, but I would like to, I try to. But I'd like to thank for this debate in the Brazilian Forum for Public Security, and I want to tell you a bit of how we became structured from the point of view of the juridical, legal, and operational parameters that respond for the logics of diagnosis, micropolitics, or policy in the contribution for the legitimation of the collaboration of the state as fostering the prevention policy. Governor Paulo Câmara created a secretary for this theme. Then in May 2019, he forwards to the legislative chamber a law project to create a social protection law, adding up all the pre-existing elements, generates a central logics of governance with local, municipal dispositions and also state dispositions for the coordination and replication of what happened already in Pacto pela Vida. It defines the diagnosis as the center of debate, and from there we make this cooperation with the three agencies that have brought us here and challenges us for the future, but ensures to us that Pernambuco will again take care of its inhabitants, its people, to organize real, honest, transparent policy, singularizing intervention, territorializing intervention, and putting to itself the challenge to implement, measure, readapt, and capitalize prevention policies. My thanks to you all for this opportunity and our commitment with this collective work. I have a very, very warm thanks to the agencies that have promoted this. Hey, your synthesis potency is an innovation near mine. I talk a lot. I'm verboragic. Well, thank you for having shared your points with us. And I will call Alessandra, who will make a graphic facilitation, one more innovation on the Public Security Forum, which graphically translates everything that was said here to call the attention of our audience in this graphic synthesis of a view, an artistic view of our production in this panel. Alessandra, please. Hey, don't let me down now. That's time to share your work. Otherwise, I'll be kicked around in social media. While you prepare, I would like to thank, on our behalf, the Forum for Public Security through Alexandra Martins, Juliana Martins for all the support and efforts. And so, Fiat Lux, here we have our, how do we call this? Our art, the synthesis, what we did in the International Day of Human Rights. Can you increase the size so that we can read what it says there? You can increase it a lot. Thank you. Oops.